Thank you. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for inviting me to speak again at your Jalsa Salana. I'm very honored to be following my dear friend, Amjad Khan, who gave you such a beautiful, beautiful speech. It's a privilege to be back with you today, 1 year after I had the honor to be here to address you on this same occasion. I want to again express my enormous gratitude for the honor you conferred upon me by making me one of your humanitarians of the year last year. It's a great privilege to speak on behalf of the persecuted throughout the world, including persecuted members of your community in places like Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. I pledge to you to continue doing this with everything that is within me for as long as I am given the opportunity to be on this earth. I know that I speak today not only for myself, but for my colleague, the great human rights champion, Dr. Katrina Lantos Sweat, and also for the staff of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, when I tell you how moved I am by the gratitude that you, your community, has expressed over the years toward all of us at the Commission on Religious Freedom who have stood with you for religious freedom and human dignity. As I stand before you today, I truly wish in my heart that I could report that we've seen freedom and dignity advance in Pakistan and in Saudi Arabia and across the globe since last year's convention. But alas, I cannot. I wish I could assure you, each of you, that over the past year the world has become more peaceful and more respectful of God-given human rights. But alas, I cannot. I wish I could say that from Nigeria to North Korea, humanity is on the rise and inhumanity is in retreat. But alas, I cannot. I wish I could tell you that freedom of religion is advancing, but again, it is not. Sadly, over the past year, since I stood at this podium, the opposite has occurred. The situation for freedom and dignity, my dear friends, has gotten even worse. The situation for religious freedom and other fundamental human rights is deteriorating. It is not improving. We must face this fact soberly and directly. On the cover of my commission's report for this year, our annual report, is a stark photograph of refugees, young and old, men, women, children. Indeed, this past year could well be called the year of the refugee, the year of the people fleeing, seeking refuge, being driven from their homes, from their communities, from all that they have known, from what they have loved, by war, oppression, injustice. On nearly every continent, people are arriving, refugees, displaced people, very often with only the clothes on their backs, seeking a place of refuge, a place of safety. From Syria to Iraq, Burma to Eritrea to the Central African Republic, people are fleeing brutal tyranny and unspeakable terror. From kidnappings and murder to rape and enslavement, from summary executions, from forced conversions, from destruction of mosques to mass killings in churches. The past 12 months have witnessed wave upon wave of brutality visited upon our fellow precious human beings, especially people of faith, Christians Muslims, people of all faiths. In the Central African Republic, for example, virtually every mosque in the entire country has been destroyed. In just that one nation, literally hundreds of mosques that existed 1 year ago are gone. In other countries, even when houses of worship are not being destroyed, those who pray inside them have been assaulted and in some cases even murdered. In Nigeria, the horrible terrorist group Boko Haram has repeatedly burst into mosques and Christian churches and slaughtered people who thought they were safe within the walls of the house of worship, people who were peacefully praying to Almighty God. Can you imagine the evil in the heart of someone who would murder someone in the course of praying to Almighty God? This breaks the heart. How can such inhumanity be committed by human beings against precious children of God? The millions of people around the world who are now homeless and fleeing bear witness to the relentless barbarism and inhumanity in the world, unleashed by tyrants and terrorists, often masquerading as defenders of faith. I was struck by the story that my friend Amjad Khan told us of the person who was held hostage by ISIS and asking his captors where they get the authority to do this, and they do not even produce a Quran. And as was said last year, so I must say again this year, you, the Ahmadiyya, find yourselves in nation after nation in the midst of this assault against human life, liberty, and dignity. In Pakistan, after all these years and decades, the government and constitution still label you as non-Muslims. On behalf of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, I again echo what our commission has said year in and year out, calling upon the government of Pakistan to remove these offensive provisions to rectify this injustice against the Ahmadiyya. The law of Pakistan still bars your brothers and sisters in the Ahmadiyya Muslim faith from calling their worship centers mosques. It still prevents them from uttering the traditional beautiful Islamic greeting or from quoting from the Quran. It still bans them from displaying the basic affirmation of Islam. It still prohibits them from sharing or publishing their beliefs. It still restricts them from building houses of worship and holding public meetings. It still stops them from voting, depriving them of their basic human right as democratic citizens to participate in the great project of self-government unless they register as non-Muslims in violation of their conscience, their sacred religious beliefs. Worst of all, Pakistan still fails to protect Ahmadi from violent religious extremist forces which continue to unleash violence and death, as we saw last year in the infamous July 27 attack and other atrocities. Just this spring, only a few months ago, members of our commission visited Pakistan to see with their own eyes if anything had changed. When they came back to this country and reported, it was with sadness that they informed us that virtually nothing in Pakistan had changed in a positive way, not for the Ahmadiyya, not for other victims of religious persecution. Pakistan's government still perpetrates and tolerates religious freedom abuses against the Ahmadiyya and other religious minorities, including Christians. And that, my friends, is precisely why I, here today, in your presence, call upon Secretary of State Kerry to finally accept the repeated recommendation of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom to designate Pakistan as a country of particular concern, marking it as one of the worst religious freedom violators in the world. It is time. It is time. Enough. Now, if all of this was being perpetrated against Ahmadiyya in Pakistan alone, that would be bad enough. But as you all know, my dear friends, Ahmadis are being persecuted elsewhere as well. Tomorrow, members of our commission and staff will travel to Indonesia to see for themselves the conditions faced by Ahmadis and other religious minorities in that country. Unfortunately, since 2008, violent extremist forces have vandalized at least 50 Ahmadiyya mosques in Indonesia and continue to pressure officials to close places of worship or ban Ahmadiyya activity altogether. In Saudi Arabia, Ahmadiyya members have been deported for their beliefs. In Egypt, they've been charged with criminal offenses under the blasphemy laws. In 2010, Yusuf's intervention helped a number of members leave Egypt for safety abroad. And from these examples, one thing is clear. Those behind the persecution of your community are among the world's worst enemies of human rights and dignity. But as I stand before you today, I am honored to be addressing a movement of people who refuse to be merely victims of tyranny, but who insist on being as you are, and I salute you for being this, champions of freedom. I'm honored to stand before you who believe that your fellow human beings, whether they are members of your faith or not, have dignity, worth, and God-given rights which no one may legitimately take away. Amjad spoke of this so beautifully. I'm honored to stand before you who believe that every person on the face of this earth has the right to worship Almighty God and practice their religion according to the dictates of their own conscience. I'm honored to stand before you today, you who after 9/11 and the terrible attacks on the United States literally gave your blood, donating more than 25,000 bags of blood in memory of those who perished on that day. Most of all, I am honored to stand before you because you, each and every day, choose freedom and dignity over tyranny and slavery. 160 years ago, more than 5 years before he was elected President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln asked his fellow Americans this question: can we as a nation continue together permanently, half slave and half free? The context you know very well. In those days, America's white people were free, but millions of Americans, African Americans, were not. They were held in bondage, the bondage of chattel slavery. Less than an hour from where we are sitting and standing right now, less than an hour from this building, we find the answer to Lincoln's question. There, on the battlefield at Gettysburg in 1863, America fought a decisive battle in a war with itself, a civil war over freedom and dignity. When the dust had settled, freedom had prevailed at enormous, at incalculable cost in blood and in treasure, but freedom had prevailed. And 2 years later, in 1865, tyranny and slavery finally surrendered. So the answer is clear. No nation can remain half slave and half free. It must be all one or all the other, as Lincoln said. But let's be clear ourselves, my friends, about the situation in the world today. The world cannot remain half slave and half free, half tyranny and half freedom. There is no permanent accommodation between our belief in freedom and the tyrants' and terrorists' practice of repression. Without freedom, above all the basic freedom to worship God peacefully, according to the dictates of conscience, there can be no true and lasting peace and harmony. A true peace is not an accommodation with violence and terror. A true peace is a peace based upon justice. May God bless this meeting with success, and may God always bless the Ahmadiyya Muslim community.